Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to talk about the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, the ETH Bitcoin valuation is something we've been tracking for quite a long time on the channel. It's a metric that I think helps identify the general health of the altcoin market. Now, that doesn't mean that some altcoins can't outperform and go against the grain. And in fact, we've seen that happen, right? There are definitely some alts that have outperformed and they've even outperformed Bitcoin. But in thinking about sort of the general market movements, right? Overall market movements, the altcoin market as a whole, not just a few cherry-picked altcoins to make the case. When we talk about the altcoin market as a whole, I do think that the ETH Bitcoin valuation is instrumental in helping us understand, is the altcoin market going to do well, or does it face some troubles? And one of the things that we've said this year, and really for the last 2.5 years, is that altcoins will likely continue to bleed back to Bitcoin until the ETH Bitcoin valuation goes to the 0.03 to 0.04 range. Now, ETH Bitcoin just hit 0.04, okay? So the upper target of the range that we said a long time ago, years ago, has finally been hit. After all this time, it's finally been hit, okay? And essentially, it's this range right here, right? 0.03 to 0.04. So this is the range that I said a while back would likely be sort of the eventual target by the end of the halving year. Right, I've said many times, I do think we could see dominance top in September at the earliest. Could also top in December, potentially. But it's really nice to see how all this has played out, and it has been difficult, obviously, going against what a lot of people want to hear and what might make sense just based on what people say, right? Fundamentals, proof of stake, deflationary, ETF, and you can see, like, this is a great example of how at the end of the day, none of that actually mattered because of monetary policy. That doesn't mean it won't ever matter. That's the thing. And that is what I want people to understand, is that I think a lot of people might look at it and say, well, none of it's ever going to matter. And it's just going to bleed forever because you had the transition from proof of work to proof of stake. You had you had this deflationary mechanism, right? That theoretically reduces the supply, which is not being reduced right now. And the spot ETF. And all three of those things, are not bad things, right? They're all good in their own right. But my argument all along was, the market doesn't actually have to make sense based on that stuff. Sometimes monetary policy trumps all of that. And this is a great example of that. It doesn't mean that that stuff doesn't matter at all. It's just that it's probably not going to matter until looser monetary policy arrives, as it relates to the ETH Bitcoin valuation, okay? Again, it doesn't mean it won't ever matter. It's just that the market doesn't care about that until looser monetary policy arrives. And one of the reasons we've talked about this before is, if you were to go look at, say, U.S. interest rates, right? Simply just U.S. interest rates. And you looked at where ETH Bitcoin bottomed just last cycle, right? We know that it didn't even bottom until after interest rates occurred. If I can find the arrow, right? We know it didn't bottom until after interest rates actually occurred. And that is, that's the the thing that I've highlighted many, many times, right? We had interest rate cuts in July of 2019, and then ETH Bitcoin shortly bottomed, bottomed very shortly later. Okay. So this cycle, I just said, look, last cycle I saw all that happen, and I recognized back then that it would have just been better to stick with Bitcoin over Ethereum until Bitcoin dominance tops, which is likely going to be around 60% and is likely going to occur around the time of rate cuts. Now, we still have not had a rate cut, right? And remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin didn't even bottom until 2 months after rate cuts. And so that is what has kept me on the right side of the ETH Bitcoin chart. Because again, if you go back and look, most analysts, I think, have not been calling for this drop, apart from, say, hardcore Bitcoin maxis, right? But they'll that's sort of the argument of for any coin against Bitcoin. And, to some degree, there are most alts do eventually bleed against Bitcoin. But this has played out, right? I mean, it has played out. ETH Bitcoin has tagged 0.04, which is the upper target of the range we set a long time ago. So then I want to talk about, what to generally expect from here, okay? Because this has been a long ride. Now, one thing to keep in mind with regards to ETH Bitcoin is that it is tagged this trend line. Again, right? So you can see this. Let me actually remove. Actually, before we get to that, I just want to mention one more thing. If you look at total assets held by the Federal Reserve, that was another thing that helped identify where ETH Bitcoin bottomed last cycle, right? It was when total assets on the balance sheet of the Fed made a U-turn, that's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed, and that hasn't happened yet, okay? So where does ETH Bitcoin go from here? Now, the first thing I will say, right, and again, this happens a lot, is that at some point in the future, it's probably going to bounce, and then everyone's going to wonder, well, is that it? Now that it's at 0.04, right, now that it has hit 0.04, I think it makes sense to soften up the bearish bias on the ETH Bitcoin ratio, right? Soften it up. What I mean by that is not that it can't go lower. It's just that I think the window for it to go lower is just between now and the end of the year. If it does not go lower by the end of December, then 0.04 is likely the low. But there's a lot of time between now and the end of December, right? The reason why I still think it makes sense to be open to the idea that ETH Bitcoin could eventually go sub 0.04 is because Bitcoin dominance has not hit 60%, which I think is what the top is going to be. And we know last cycle it didn't bottom until after rate cuts and once the Fed began to expand their balance sheet. Neither of those two things have occurred yet. Now, that doesn't mean that ETH Bitcoin can't bounce. In fact, there's been many times where it has bounced off of this trend line and many times where people wrongly assumed that that was the bottom, right? I mean, it's happened so much, and it is exhausting, right? I mean, it is exhausting sort of having the same arguments over and over and over again with people, but I think it's safe to say that the views that I'd like to come out and say when I'm wrong a lot. I really do. I hope you guys have seen that this year. I do say when I'm wrong, but this is one thing that I really do think that I've been on the right side of for the last several years, and I mean, it's hit 0.04, it's bounced back up to 0.042. The bull mark support band's got to be a lot higher. I mean, it's all the way back at 0.05, right? I mean, it's so much higher than the current levels. So then the question is like, well, what's going to happen from here? Well, one option is that ETH Bitcoin bounces and then doesn't actually roll back over again for a couple more months. Okay, that sometimes happens where it hits a low, like here was in October, and then it came back down in January. Here's another example where it hit a low in April and then it came back down in May. Okay, so that happens a lot. And, it's important to be aware that something like that could certainly happen. Again, there is also a chance that it breaks the trend line. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that has to be your base case, of course, but sometimes the way you actually enter into final capitulation is to break the trend line that you thought you would never break, right? And that sort of leads to that final capitulation. Again, that doesn't have to happen, but if ETH Bitcoin did something like this, and did that or something, that could actually mark the final capitulation low, and then it sort of builds its way back up in 2025. If, on the other hand, right, instead of doing something like that, if it were to just sort of bounce around here, then by the end of the year, that would probably mean that 0.04 would be the low if it's unable to take that out. I mean, what I mean by that is that if it's not able to take out 0.04 before end of year, then I would say 0.04 would be the low. But because Bitcoin dominance is not at 60, and because the Fed has not cut rates, and because they have not begun to expand their balance sheet, that's why it still makes sense to be open-minded about it going slightly lower. Now, in the grand scheme of things, ETH Bitcoin has dropped from the highs, it's dropped 54%. Now, some people will say it's holding up well, but again, this whole market has fooled them into thinking it's holding up well as it just continues to slowly go down. And it's been and part of I think the hardest part for me was, in my own mind, being very sure that this was a likely outcome and just having to spend so long waiting for it, right? That's like the hardest part, just waiting, being confident that it's likely going to happen, but not being obviously 100% sure because no one can predict the markets, but being very sure that the most likely scenario is something like this, and just having to wait years, to watch it play out. So, we'll see where ETH Bitcoin goes in the short term, but I do think that, it could certainly bounce around a little. And I think there's still a risk of it going sub 0.04. It might not happen immediately. One of the things that we've talked about before, would be looking at like monthly candles on ETH Bitcoin. And I mean, you can see that it seems like it's getting into this like final, sort of capitulation that you've seen the last couple of cycles, where it just really starts to bleed into, I mean, it might even bleed into, I mean, you can see this one over here. You had 3 red candles and then it bottomed in September. There's a chance that you see something similar like that, right? You got 3 red candles right here. What happens if it does break below this trend line in September, and then that ends up being the low, and then maybe it actually corresponds to, the first rate cut of 50 basis points. Last time, ETH Bitcoin did not bottom on the first rate cut, but the last time the first rate cut was only 25 basis points. If it's 50 basis points, maybe that would make it more likely for it to just simply bottom out in September. And then what you could see happen would be something like that, where, it might find a low in September and then sort of double bottom in December. That's also an option, right? That's also an option. And of course, it could always go back up to the bull market support band and test that as well. But I think that the ETH Bitcoin ratio is getting close to whatever the low is going to be, if it's not already there. Okay. My base case is that it will go below 0.04. But if by the end of the year it hasn't, then my base case will be that 0.04 is the low. So I just want to be clear about that, right? I think ETH Bitcoin will go up in 2025, is what I think. So in 2025, I think ETH Bitcoin will go up. It's just there's a lot of time between now and the end of the year. And in terms of seasonality, Bitcoin tends to have better seasonality in Q4 than Ethereum. And that's, that's kind of where I think we are right now. And so when we talked earlier about ETH Bitcoin and how it's useful for understanding the altcoin market, one of the things you probably noticed over the last year is that so many people have been so confident in the altcoin market, right? So many people have been so confident. And one of the reasons is because, they were looking at it and they were saying, oh, well, the altcoin market is just here, right? It's basically there. They were unwilling to accept that maybe it's here. Maybe it was here back in 2019, just before the Fed cut rates. And I think that was what people missed, right? They were looking at this. They were looking at the halving year but they should have been looking at 2019, not the halving year, because 2019 is when the Fed cut rates, right? If you overlay US interest rates, that's when the Fed cut rates last cycle. And so to me, this was always the more likely, outcome. And you can see that that is more or less what has been happening. And the reason that we knew that that was a likely outcome, again, there were still no guarantees, but the reason we thought that, hey, people might be getting ahead of themselves is because when you looked at alt Bitcoin pairs, when you looked at those, you could say, well, all these people are so confident, right, that they're right and that altcoins have already gone through this entire process. But the thing that they're missing is that last cycle, when alt Bitcoin pairs, or when altcoins were making that move that people were hoping they were making a few months ago, they had already visited the range lows, right? Whereas this cycle, they haven't visited the range lows yet. And so I think that was sort of the missing component for a lot of people this cycle, is that that actually didn't play out in 2023 like it did in 2019. And so you're actually seeing it play out in 2024 because it didn't actually play out in 2023. If it had played out in 2023, then I would have been right there with you, thinking that it was more likely to be something similar to that. But it didn't play out in 2023. And, I think it's a necessary component of the crypto space. That altcoins are oscillators against Bitcoin at best. And I think that is what helped keep me on the right side of the market by seeing, look, guys, alt Bitcoin pairs still need to run the lows, and they just simply haven't done that yet. And we know that last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs collapsed into their lows. They started the collapse 1 month before the first rate cut. 1 month before the first rate cut. And, you can kind of see something maybe similar will play out again, right? I mean, alt Bitcoin pairs, it's 1 month about before the first rate cut. And, they're at 0.39. They're below the initial wick low at 0.04, potentially back testing it. And, I think there's a good case to be made that it's going to go down to 0.25. And that in that process, I think you'll see Bitcoin dominance go to approximately 60%. So, all this is played out. One of the things that I've mentioned as well is this website over here, right, where you're tracking the supply of ETH, and I've mentioned this many, many times, but, really it has turned inflationary in recent months. And I don't know how many people are looking at this, but, I mean, over the last 30 days, the supply is up 56,000 ETH, right? Now, over the last, basically since the merge, it's obviously still down, but it's only down to negative 262,000, whereas back in April, it was at negative 457,000. So essentially, you've added about 200,000 ETH to the supply since April. If you continue at this pace, right, if you look at what's happened in 30 days, supply of ETH's going up about 60,000 ETH or so a month. Again, by the end of the year, at this pace, it would go inflationary even when compared to the merge, which might actually correspond to a macro bottom on the ETH Bitcoin pair, just as it goes inflationary, right? Wouldn't that be interesting? Goes inflationary, people finally are like, okay, fine, and then that ends up being the low. I mean, it's a possibility, right? I wouldn't put it past the market for ETH Bitcoin to bottom out when it goes inflationary. I mean, as compared to the merge, that would be. And the reason why it's interesting because it's kind of like it seems like it could play out like that, right? I mean, 60,000 ETH a month. You got about 4 months, a little over 4 months before it would go inflationary as measured from the merge. It's already August, so September, October, November, December, right? December. Now, if it is December, it could either be a double bottom. Maybe you get one low in September and then a double bottom in December. The other option, right? The other, I think, equally valid option could be that if ETH Bitcoin finds some type of relief in the short term and bounces back up, then normally when that happens, it takes a couple of months for it to then go back down and put in a lower low, right? And we've seen this happen many, many times. I mean, even back over here, right in May, I said, all right, when it gets this bounce, normally you would expect it to take about 2 months, right? And then you got June, July, and you can see that really at the very end of July and then early August, that's where it broke down again. So, if it were to bounce again, then that could take you all the way out until October before it's coming back down to these levels. Again, I mean, it's always worthwhile to hedge, I think. And I do think that ETH Bitcoin is actually pretty close to the lows, whatever those lows end up being. But I'm just trying to put out, hey, these are my thoughts, and it's really nice to see this how it has played out. And I think a lot of people sort of they mistake me for someone that wants to see something happen, whereas I'm just saying I just think this is going to happen, right? It's not that I necessarily want what I talk about to happen. It's just what I think's going to happen based on what historically happens during tighter monetary policy periods, right? And I think that's the trick with investing, and what drives a lot of people to make bad decisions is they listen to my view about it, but they're not willing to actually digest that view, because it goes against what they want to see happen in their portfolio, right? So they just ignore it. But again, it's more so just a thought of like, this is what I thought was going to happen, and for some reason I decided to be very vocal about it. I don't really think I'll be as vocal in the future, but it is not. I mean, it feels like it's been a really long journey, and if you've been on the journey with me, thanks for being here. I do appreciate it, and I think we're getting close to the end. So we'll see. We'll see where it ultimately goes. As I've said before, a lot of times when you get these bubble phases, they eventually return to where it started from, and that would be what I would consider sort of right around here. And that's why 0.03 to 0.04 always seem to make the most amount of sense. Because before that, right, it was just sort of steadily increasing. I wouldn't really consider that to be sort of a bubble, and then it really went up quickly. And that was kind of where the bubble started. And now it's just kind of coming back down to where that bubble started. I don't think it has to come back down here, but that 0.03 to 0.04 range has always, made, I think, the most amount of sense to me. So those are my views on the ETH Bitcoin valuation. And of course, as it relates to a lot of different metrics that we've talked about as well, that's important. ETH Bitcoin is sort of a compass for the altcoin market. If you have a reason to think ETH Bitcoin is going to go down, that's generally not a good thing for alts. If you think ETH Bitcoin is going to go up, that's generally a good thing for alts. So that's where we stand. We've been talking about it for years. Thank you for coming along the journey. And if you'd ever, if you were right there with me every step of the way, and kind of thinking that, all right, these are all just lower highs, and people are too impatient. You guys know how I feel, because these are weekly candles. I mean, look how many weeks this has taken. And here we are after all this time. So we'll see what happens here in the short term with ETH Bitcoin. 0.042. I mean, it's just kind of crazy to look at it, right? I mean, 0.042. Here we are, and it's been a long time coming. But anyways, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.